Something is leaking out of the Cleveland Browns facility right now, and I don't mean that casually. When sources inside an NFL building start talking to media, when the carefully maintained silence that organizations work so hard to preserve starts developing cracks, it means the internal pressure has gotten to a point where it can no longer be fully contained. And what's coming out of Cleveland right now points to a genuine power struggle at the highest level of that organization. A head coach who has made his evaluation and is standing behind it. An owner who is pushing back with real force. And a rookie quarterback sitting at the center of all of it, continuing to do exactly what he's been doing since he arrived. Working, preparing, rising. I've gone through everything that's been reported and everything that's been implied, and I want to give you the honest, fully examined version of what's actually happening inside this franchise right now. Here's what the sourced reporting is telling us. Todd Monken has arrived at a decision on his starting quarterback, and that decision is Shedeur Sanders. Not as a preliminary lean, not as a competition frontrunner subject to revision based on training camp performance. As his quarterback. The player he intends to build his offensive system around, develop throughout the entire offseason, and hand the keys to when real football begins. That level of commitment, if the reporting is accurate, and the specificity of what's leaking suggests it is, represents something fundamentally different from the careful, hedged language that coaching staffs typically use to describe quarterback situations in April. Monken is not leaving a door open. He has looked at what he has in that building, made his professional judgment, and is apparently prepared to defend it. To understand why that judgment has landed where it has, you need to understand what the private conversation about Deshaun Watson actually sounds like inside that facility, because the gap between the public language the organization has maintained around him and the private reality is significant. Publicly, the Browns have been consistent in their careful, supportive framing, measured words, appropriate deference, never fully closing any door. That's standard organizational management, and it makes complete sense from a professional relationship standpoint. But what's being described by people with genuine proximity to the internal evaluation is something considerably darker in tone. The concern isn't framed as the normal physical risk that accompanies any quarterback's career. It's described as something more acute and more specific than that. The coaching staff's worry, as it's been relayed by sources, is that Watson could sustain a serious injury within the opening minutes of any game he starts, not over the course of the season, not after absorbing a full game's worth of contact, at the very beginning. Before the offense has run a meaningful number of plays, I want you to really think about what that level of concern means in practical terms for a coaching staff trying to build a competitive football team. You cannot construct a game plan around a quarterback when your own internal medical evaluation suggests the plan might collapse before it's executed. You cannot ask a coaching staff to invest weeks of preparation, scheme installation, personnel grouping decisions, tempo adjustments, red zone design, into a player whose availability you consider genuinely uncertain from the opening possession. And you absolutely cannot ask a fan base that has already absorbed years of disappointment around this specific situation to invest their emotional energy in a product that your own people believe might not survive contact with the first game of the year. When a coaching staff reaches that level of concern about a starting quarterback, the decision doesn't require a long deliberation. The logic of the situation makes it for you. Monken looked at that reality clearly and reached the only conclusion that makes sense from a football standpoint. Shedeur Sanders, whatever developmental work remains ahead of him as a player making the transition from college to professional football, offers something Watson currently cannot: the baseline guarantee of physical presence. He can be developed. He can receive first-team reps throughout the offseason and build genuine familiarity with the system being installed around him. He can grow from week 1 through week 18 in ways that produce real, observable improvement. His ceiling is entirely unknown because nobody has given him the full infrastructure and full preparation that a quarterback needs to show what he actually is. Watson, at this specific point in his career and in his physical condition, cannot offer any of those things with confidence. That asymmetry between a player whose upside is genuinely unexplored and a player whose risks have become severe enough to make even basic reliability uncertain is apparently what drove Monken's conclusion. But here's where the situation becomes something more layered and more dramatic than a simple coaching evaluation. Todd Monken is not operating with unanimous organizational support on this decision. Jimmy Haslam, the owner of the Cleveland Browns, is reportedly applying real pressure in the opposite direction. Haslam, based on what's coming out of the building, still wants Watson, still believes that the investment the organization made in him deserves another opportunity to produce returns, still isn't ready to formally close the door on a veteran quarterback and hand the franchise's present to an unproven rookie. And that misalignment between a head coach who has made his football judgment and an owner who has reached a different conclusion based on a different set of priorities is the genuine fault line running through the Cleveland organization right now. I want to be fair to Haslam's position, because I think dismissing it as simply emotional or irrational misses something real. Watson's contract is not an abstraction. It is $230 million in fully guaranteed money that represents one of the most consequential financial commitments in NFL ownership history. Every day that contract sits on the books without producing wins is a day that has to be explained and defended to partners, to the business infrastructure around the team, to a fan base that was told this investment would eventually pay off. The desire to see Watson get another legitimate opportunity isn't purely about football judgment. There is a financial and reputational dimension to it that any honest person should acknowledge. Haslam isn't advocating for Watson because he doesn't understand football. He's advocating for him because the weight of that contract creates real organizational pressure that coaches don't carry the same way owners do. But understanding the source of Haslam's position doesn't make it the right call. And the more interesting and frankly more revealing part of this dynamic is what Monken appears to be doing in response to it. He's holding. The reporting suggests that despite the ownership pressure, despite having the most powerful individual in the organization pushing him toward a different decision, Monken is maintaining his position on Shedeur. He is not adjusting his language to create more wiggle room. He is not quietly signaling to Watson's camp that the door remains open in ways that soften the decision without reversing it. He is, by all accounts, standing where he stood when he made his evaluation, and that tells you something essential about the kind of coach Todd Monken intends to be in Cleveland. The coaches who fold the moment ownership expresses a preference aren't really running their programs. They're managing the relationship with the person who controls their employment, which is a completely different thing. A coach who absorbs real pressure from the most powerful person in the building, processes it, considers it, and then maintains his professional judgment anyway. That's a coach with genuine conviction about what he's doing. That's a coach who is willing to put his reputation and ultimately his tenure on the line for an evaluation he believes in. Whether that stance survives the full arc of this offseason, whether Haslam ultimately accepts it or escalates his involvement in ways that force the issue, that is a storyline with real stakes and real consequences that we have not seen the full shape of yet. Let me step back and put all of this inside the broader Cleveland Browns context, because I think the historical weight of what's happening right now deserves direct acknowledgement. This franchise has been carrying one of the most painful quarterback legacies in professional football for going on 2 decades. The players who came through that building and generated genuine hope before the ceiling collapsed, that list is long enough and consistent enough to have become its own kind of story within the larger story of the organization. Veterans brought in to stabilize things. Young quarterbacks brought in through the draft to build around. Record-breaking contracts extended to players the organization believed would finally be the answer. None of it produced the stability that every franchise needs around its most important position. The Watson situation is only the most recent and most expensive chapter in that ongoing narrative, and it has, by any objective measure, been the most damaging chapter in terms of the organizational resources it consumed relative to what it returned. The Cleveland fan base has absorbed all of it, every cycle of hope and disappointment, every press conference where a coaching staff expressed confidence in a quarterback who subsequently proved that confidence premature, Every season that began with genuine belief and ended with the familiar reset. These are people who have continued to show up and invest in this franchise through circumstances that would have exhausted most fan bases, and they deserve to have the people making decisions for this team operating with genuine clarity of purpose rather than the kind of muddled compromise that comes from an owner and a head coach pulling in different directions. Shedeur Sanders, if Monken gets the organizational backing to pursue this the way the reporting suggests he intends to, represents something genuinely different from the previous patterns. Not because his success is guaranteed. Nobody in honest possession of their faculties can promise outcomes about an unproven professional quarterback. But because the approach being described is the correct one. You commit to the young quarterback. You build the entire offseason around his development. You give him first-team reps from the beginning so that when regular season football begins, he has the foundational preparation that his partial first season completely denied him. You put organizational resources, scheme design, and coaching attention behind developing this specific player rather than managing the competing priorities of a quarterback room pulled in multiple directions. That is how franchises build durable answers at the position, not by hedging and hoping, by committing and developing. Watson's response to all of this has apparently reflected the difficulty of his situation without improving it in any way. He is not taking the direction things are heading quietly, and honestly, from a purely human standpoint, that's understandable. He still believes he has starting caliber football left in him. He still sees himself as a professional quarterback who can contribute at the highest level if given the opportunity. That competitive self-belief, the refusal to accept a diminished role, the insistence on fighting for position, is in some vacuum version of reality a quality you'd respect. But we are not in a vacuum. We are in the specific, documented, painful reality of what Watson's tenure in Cleveland has actually produced. The injury history is what it is. The medical concerns inside the building are what they are. The trade market that generated zero interested teams despite active shopping efforts told its own unambiguous story. A loud reaction to being passed over doesn't alter any of those facts. It doesn't change the evaluation. It doesn't move the injury timeline. And it doesn't improve the dynamic inside a locker room that is already navigating more than enough complexity. Here is my honest read on where all of this sits and where it's heading. Monken is right. Not just tactically right in the narrow sense of making a sound depth chart decision. Philosophically, right in the sense that matters more. The Cleveland Browns cannot continue making decisions that are shaped more by the need to justify previous commitments than by honest assessment of what gives them the best path forward. Sunk cost reasoning has been one of the most persistent and damaging forces in this franchise's quarterback decision-making for years. The Watson contract represents an enormous sunk cost, and the natural organizational impulse, reinforced by Haslam's pressure, is to keep that cost from feeling wasted by extracting more performance from it. But that impulse, however psychologically understandable, leads to bad football decisions. The money is already committed. It does not come back regardless of whether Watson starts or doesn't start. The only real question is what gives this franchise the best chance of building something meaningful, and the answer to that question is not complicated when you look at it honestly. Monken choosing to stand behind Shedeur even with ownership pushing hard in the other direction is the most important leadership decision he has made in his Cleveland tenure. If he holds that ground, if Haslam ultimately accepts the football judgment his coach has delivered, then the Browns will enter 2026 with the clarity of purpose and the developmental structure that young quarterbacks need to actually develop. First-team reps from day one, a scheme installation built around his specific skills and processing profile, a season where growth is the expectation rather than a pleasant surprise. That is what Shedeur was denied last year, and it is what his development genuinely requires. The half-measure version of this, where Watson gets meaningful first-team time throughout the offseason to protect the ownership relationship, where the competition stays artificially open to avoid the internal confrontation, where Shedeur is nominally the guy, but organizationally the resources are divided. That version produces the worst of all possible outcomes. It delays Shedeur's development, it prolongs Watson's uncertainty, and it sends a locker room the signal that the people in charge aren't actually sure what they're doing. The coming weeks are going to resolve this one way or another. Either Monken's evaluation holds and the organizational structure gets built around Shedeur with the full commitment the approach requires, or Haslam's pressure produces enough movement to muddy the situation back toward the deliberate ambiguity that has characterized the Browns' public posture for months. Those two outcomes produce very different versions of the 2026 Cleveland Browns season, and they produce very different pictures of what this franchise is actually capable of becoming. I know which one the football evidence supports, and I think anyone who has been watching this situation honestly, past the media noise, past the contract conversations, past the organizational politics, knows too.